Okay, now welcome to the next lesson. In this lesson, we are going to discuss chapter 2. And before we start discussing chapter 2, I'd like to discuss these notes that I made. All right, and it's important to know the historical context of Oliver Twist. All right, so when this book was written and why Charles Dickens wrote this book in the first place. Who was he anyway? And why did he write this? Now, you must know that in the mid 19th century, um, Oliver Twist was written between 1837 and 1839. It was written as a series of stories and not just one book. At that time, England was suffering from economic instability, which means that it was a poor country. All right. There was widespread unemployment. People didn't have jobs. And this was because of the wars that England and France waged with each other. And the English government, after the wars were over, they imposed heavy taxes to pay for the war. And this did not affect the wealthy people, the rich people, but the poor people really suffered because prices of everyday goods they rose, the food became scarce, there was unemployment, and the French and European markets they closed for English goods, so people were unemployed and they had no jobs, they had no income, no source of income. Also, because of the Industrial Revolution, during the Industrial Revolution, lots of machinery was made, because of which people started getting fired because factory owners did not need them anymore. They had the machines to do their work for them. And during this time, people were so poor that children had to work. They worked long hours, just like what you see in Oliver Twist. In 1834, the Poor Laws were passed, and according to this law, poor people who wanted government help, who wanted public assistance, they would get it, but they had to live in workhouses. And in workhouses, just like a workhouse in which Oliver stayed, it was terrible. People were treated badly, they were poorly fed, and this was arranged so that people would stop asking for help. And in these workhouses, there was a lot of human suffering, as you'll see in this entire book, Oliver Twist. People were also sent to a place called the debtor's prison. That is, if somebody could not pay his if you owed a sum of money to someone and couldn't pay back, you would be sent to this special prison. Charles Dickens himself was a child worker when his father was sent to a debtor's prison. He worked as a child himself, and during his time there was extreme poverty in London. So you will see that Charles Dickens reflected all this. All this is reflected in his novel Oliver Twist. We'll do more about this in the next chapter, but for now, this much is important to know. Then, in the second chapter, the characters that we come across are, oh, I'm holding this page back, sorry. So you see, we are introduced to Mr. Sowerberry, who was the local undertaker. That is, he was the one who used to arrange funerals when people died. Mrs. Sowerberry, his wife, she was a thin lady with a disagreeable face, very mean and selfish. Charlotte, she was the girl who worked with Mr. and Mrs. Sowerberry. And Noah Claypole, he was a charity boy who worked with Mr. and Mrs. Sowerberry. There was a clear difference between a charity boy and a workhouse boy. You see this in chapter 2 because Oliver was a workhouse boy. He had no idea who his parents were. Whereas Noah Claypole was a charity boy. He went to a charity school. That is, his education was paid by wealthy people. He didn't pay for it himself, but he knew who his parents were. He's been described as a clumsy 14-year-old boy with a large head, very small eyes, and a red nose. And what happens in the story, the main things that happen in the story, we see that at the beginning of the chapter, Oliver is locked up in a dark room for almost a week and he's beaten by Mr. Bumble in front of the other workhouse boys because he had asked for more food. And Mr. Bumble beat him in front of the boys so that the other boys could be warned not to ask for more again. And then after a while, Oliver was sent to work with Mr. Sowerberry. At Mr. Sowerberry's place, he was not given a very warm welcome. Mrs. Sowerberry said, "Oh, he's so small and he's going to eat up so much of food." When she takes him down to get him some food, she tells this girl Charlotte, "Give him the meat that the dog had left." Imagine. And Oliver was so hungry that he just attacked the meat, like an animal, because he was starving. And then at Mr. Sowerberry's place, he meets Charlotte, of course, and Noah Claypole, who's a big bully, right? And he really mistreats Oliver, because Noah was mistreated himself as a charity boy. Boys his age used to make fun of him because he was a charity boy. So he thought, well, Oliver is of a much lower level, so he thought he could, inflict all his misery, all the pain that he could inflict this on Oliver. And that's exactly what he did. And then Oliver begins to work as an assistant to Mr. Sowerberry. He goes with Mr. Sowerberry on his first day of work. They go to pick up the body of this lady who had died. And you see in the description of, the way the house has been described, the street has been described where Mr. Sowerberry and Oliver had to go to pick up the body, dirty streets, the house is almost falling down. And how these people looked, even the rats that had died in that area, they looked as if they had died out of starvation. And even the people, they looked thin and ratty. And this woman, that's what her husband said, died of starvation. Anyway, they pick up the body, and the next day, this lady is buried. The priest, oh yes, there's a priest also who comes in, who seems not to be really bothered about the emotions of the people. And he was not really concerned, like he was not a very passionate priest. He was just doing his job, and he seemed to be in a hurry. Just like what you see, like in the beginning, you see Oliver's mother. When she dies, the doctor was a busy doctor. He was just doing his job, not really bothered whether she would survive or not. The priest was the same. Now, there's one last thing I'd like to talk about, is the conflicts. The conflict in the story is, the problems that the writer speaks about. And very clearly, you can see that the writer is speaking about the problem of poverty in London at that time. People were so poor. Oliver's mother, she was an unwed girl. So society did not accept unwed girls, and especially unwed girls who were to give birth to a baby. So she had to probably run away from her house to give birth to that baby. And you see a lot of human suffering, how people are tortured, the way Mr. Bumble beats up Oliver, the way Mrs. Sowerberry treats Oliver. So this is all really sad. So there's a lot of human suffering in this story. So these are the conflicts in the story, the problems in the story that Charles Dickens wants us to know about. All right. So I'm really curious to see what you all have in your story map. Everyone will fill it in differently, of course, I know that, but that's okay. At the end, once we finish all these chapters, we will share our story maps with each other. I would like to see regular updates of your story map. In the next lesson, I would like you all to read chapter 3. We finished chapter 1 and chapter 2. So read chapter 3 and then fill in the story map accordingly. All right. And then in the next lesson, we are going to discuss chapter 3. I think we'll just do chapter 1 to 5, and then we'll stop. Then we'll begin with the other book. But let's finish the first 5 chapters first. Right? See you in the next lesson.